Let's start by immediately dispelling the notion that all adaptations are bad. Big surprise, as with any sweeping generalization, the argument quickly falls apart when you look at the likes of The Lord of the Rings, The Last of Us, and The Walking Dead. All three stemming from entirely different kinds of media, but all, for the most part at least, doing it justice. In that sense, I think I've actually been particularly lucky, because the three examples I just mentioned also just so happen to be some of my favorite IPs of all time, and I would wholeheartedly say that seeing the live-action versions come to life massively elevated my love for the franchise as a whole. And while I myself do not care in the slightest for superhero stories, I also love the first seasons of The Flash, for example, which again comes from a comic book that I normally wouldn't even care about. Ditto for Marvel. I know next to nothing about it, so do take this with a grain of salt, but I think the adapted stories there all completely justify the adaptation process. Point being that these cross-medium adaptations open up the franchise to many people who might otherwise just not know about it. I am a certified anime enjoyer, but hearing the 700th person in a row say that they won't watch a show just because it's anime gets very, very old. Yes, it's a silly thing to say, as I think writing off an entire medium is kinda narrow-minded, but whatever. If it means sharing my favorite stories with others, sure, why not? Turn them into live action. I've made a ton of Walking Dead content, so I can tell you for certain that there are countless people who, 1, didn't even know the story comes from a comic book, or 2, started reading the comic book only because of the live-action version. To me, that's what all of this is about, talking about the things we enjoy. Even now, I am talking to you because I enjoy talking about various forms of media. But at the same time, let's not kid ourselves because it is not that simple. There is another, very near and dear story to me that was not only butchered but dragged through the mud, disowned, dethroned, and just destroyed by the adaptation process. That, of course, being the movie that shall not be named because there is no live-action Avatar in Ba Sing Se. But even in the face of that, I do believe the pros outweigh the cons, and I have always taken the stance of, sure, give it a shot. If it's good, great, we all have more good content to enjoy. If it's bad, well, we still have the original and nothing has been lost. Which naturally brings up the question of, why does this happen? Why do we have a decent Death Note live-action version from back in 2006, but we also have the basically parody that is the 2017 Netflix version? Or better yet, why do we have movies like Edge of Tomorrow that too are based on a Japanese light novel, but barely anyone even knows that it has source material? Well, I think much of this comes down to a lack of vision or clashing visions. When you think of, let's say, George R.R. Martin, you immediately think of the bleakness of Game of Thrones and the world of Westeros. When you think of Oda, you imagine deep character narratives interwoven with a wacky fantasy world of pirates that is One Piece. When you think of Stephen King, you imagine the reality-bending horror of his worlds from The Shining to The Outsider. Each and every one of these stories immediately gives you a very clear sense of the author's intent and the tone of their stories. It's that unquantifiable and not entirely explainable heart of these narratives and the author. When you read an excerpt or see a part of these stories in any form, you can pretty confidently say that, yes, this is them, right? And the absolute same thing goes for making cinema. When you see a Christopher Nolan film, you know it's a Christopher Nolan film. And so when it comes to this adaptation process, I think far and away the most vital aspect that you must understand before you put pen to paper and start scripting or casting or anything like that is the tone of the story you are trying to replicate. Nothing else will matter if you do not understand the heart of the story. Think back to all of the legendary shows you've seen. You might have noticed that many of them hold one thing in common: the cold open. A sequence that airs before even the title card and is often used to hook viewers or to sort of set the scene, if you will. I don't think it's a particularly hot take to say that I believe adaptations should also stand on their own as completely independent productions. Anyone who is not familiar with the source material should be able to experience it and still enjoy it. For some reason, people seem completely fine with the sentiment with the likes of the Game of Thrones or the Lord of the Rings, but whenever it comes to anime, there is this weird gatekeepy thing. I think it shouldn't just be blatant fan service, and no, I don't mean that sort of fan service, settle down, or require you to read or watch the source material or anything like that. It should be its own thing that is simply adapted from a different form of media. Before we get to some successful adaptation examples, let me use Breaking Bad, a story that was of course written from scratch to illustrate what I mean with the tone. The opening scene drops us right into the heart of the desert, with intense music playing as Walter desperately tries fleeing from something or someone. Their bodies in the RV, he himself is literally naked, he crashes the RV, and then proceeds to film a video for his family as we hear police sirens in the background. In the space of just 3 minutes, we learn a lot about Walter. We see that he's an intelligent man who has somehow ended up in a situation that is way over his head. The bodies and the lab equipment suggest that he's committed, or is at least a part of, some very serious crimes. We also see that he is a family man, leaving both his documents to be identified, as well as filming a video for his family, worried about what would happen to them if he is caught. Finally, we see that despite the situation he has gotten himself into, he's immensely headstrong. Even while still half naked, he walks right into the middle of the streets and holds up a gun, immediately showcasing how Walter would handle many of his problems later on. Right away, we know what we are watching. This is a story about a man who will do anything, no matter how bad, some might even say he will break bad, to provide for his family. His bullish attitude already hinting at the trouble he would find himself in. That is the heart of the story, and that cannot be changed. Everything else is fair game, but that part of the story needs to be there. Think of Light from Death Note, a natural prodigy with an impeccable workflow, a nice loving family, and perfectly normal life. He follows his routines to a T and is bored out of his mind. You need to look at the Netflix version for all of 30 seconds to realize that they fundamentally do not understand the story it is telling. Not because it changes details around it, that is perfectly fine, but because the underlying tone of the world the story paints is just not even remotely close. To tie this back into our Breaking Bad example, it's like if you removed all the surrounding issues that Walter's life had and made all of his decisions stem purely from his diagnosis. On a very surface level, it is still very similar, right? But because you've now removed all the preceding drama, the tone of the story shifts on a fundamental level. Which brings me onto the second vital acknowledgement of the adaptation process. Once you understand the tone of the world and the story you are telling, you must very carefully evaluate how you're going to translate, and I mean translate, not copy the material. We'll get to more concrete examples in a moment, but I think something you'll notice with a lot of these failed adaptations is not just that they are poor imitations of the source material, but that they are also just not particularly good when looked at as a standalone piece of media. The most prominent example of this has to be the first adaptation of Avatar, which is both just terrible as well as not faithful at all to the source material. From a plain filmmaking perspective, the pacing and the story flow of the movie is just plain bad. There is no build-up or big payoff, and everything just sort of happens out of the blue, to the point that I think if someone saw this movie who genuinely did not know a single thing about Avatar, it literally just seems like a compilation of events with little to no explanation why anything actually happens and if any of it is important. There is no pivotal turn during the solstice, somehow the effects of the war seem even more surface level than a PG-7 cartoon, and the list just goes on. From just an independent film perspective, it is just boring and not very well written. And from an adaptation perspective, oh, it just gets worse. Changing the way everyone's names are pronounced for the reason of quote-unquote setting itself apart is just weird. The stoic and powerful earthbending moves were reduced to a clown dance with about as much energy as I have IRL. It has literally none of the charm of the original, and the characters are just lifeless husks, and the list just goes on. There are countless videos, some multiple hours long, dissecting the horrors that is the movie that shall not be named within Ba Sing Se. But point is, it is a failure because it did not understand the type of story it was trying to tell. You cannot change the tone of the story on a fundamental level and try to make it this broody and mature story, while also trying to copy the original narrative. But for all of its faults, it is important to note that this version did have a vision. It is simply a vision that did not work at all with Avatar on a very fundamental level. And here, there is a bit of a more touchy problem that I have observed. What I would describe as a bit of an ego problem when it comes to these adaptations. One of the funniest things I've learned now that we are getting more and more of these live-action adaptations are people jumping to the question of, why would you even try to replicate anything at all? If there is a book or something, why would you try to turn it into a series at all? And if you do, why wouldn't you change it? Why would I watch something if I've already read it? But the thing is, the anime industry has been adapting series from manga and light novels for literal decades, with the explicit goal of replicating the original vision as closely as they can. Again, not copy, but translate. They bring the material into a new medium and leverage the additional degrees of freedom to elevate the original story. Most of the anime industry relies on this one core principle, waiting for the next big manga series to be adapted into anime. But why do I bring this up? Well, because I think there is a very stark cultural difference between how Western and Japanese productions handle adaptations. And I think simply acknowledging that will help shed a bit more light on how certain things turn out. Again, Japanese studios, for better or worse, will always stick to the original material and not deviate unless there is just some sort of huge limitation in place or something like that. Just to give you two quick examples, take Fullmetal Alchemist. When the anime was originally being produced, the manga hadn't ended yet, and so they wrote a new story for the anime's ending. But after the manga ended, they went back and redid the story again from episode 1. This is why you'll often hear people tell you to watch Brotherhood. That is the actual adaptation of the manga story that was produced only afterwards. It's not a sequel, it's not a prequel, it is the actual manga story. So again, immense respect and focus on the original story.
Luffy. Not Luffy. Luffy.
To bring this into live action though, the 2006 Death Note live action version from Japan is just the original story. It's nothing groundbreaking and by modern standards it is very low key, but it is mostly just a simplified replication of the original story. But now if we go back to the West and return to Avatar for a minute, the live action version changed how names were pronounced for no other reason than deliberately detaching it from the original. And I've heard some say that this is a good thing, that this means they are trying to make it stand on its own. But no, to me that just seems like a weird, almost petty surface level change to basically say that this is mine now. I am totally fine with story changes because again, translate, do not copy. But changing small things like names to me is more so a red flag about the production as a whole. It's such an unnecessary thing that it almost makes me wonder what the motivation of the adaptation is. Is it really to pay respect to the original and bring it to a new audience, or rather, just some selfish pursuits? But okay, I'll let you think about that as that is a whole nother rabbit hole to dive down. Now, let's pull all of this together and finally look at some more concrete examples. So number 1 is tone. A bleak story should have a bleak and depressing adaptation. A whimsical story should not be turned into a drama, and so on. And number 2, respect the material but translate it, do not copy it. A human character with a wacky design. Usopp's long nose, for example. Yes, it is very iconic, but it will seem odd in live action. Keep his character as is, make him wacky goofy, maybe even throw in a few lines about how his nose grows when he lies as a cheeky wink at the fans, but get rid of it. Make changes when needed, especially to fit the medium. Leverage the new tools at your disposal that come with a live action setting, but do not deviate from the vision of the author. And to start off with what is in my opinion nearly an excellent example of what a live action adaptation can be, I want to look at The Last of Us, a series that is adapted from a very narrative focused video game and naturally seemed like a good fit for the HBO treatments. If you are super sensitive to spoilers, I will mention some minor things out of context. But with that, let's apply my made up rules to it. Number 1 is tone. Right from the get-go, the show adds a cold open that was not present in the game. It's set in 1968, coincidentally the same year that George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead released, which is basically responsible for the zombie genre as we know it today, and also the year climate change was formally acknowledged. Both facts that will be very relevant for everything to follow. We see a few scientists discuss how fungi could potentially thrive if the climate were to just get a little bit warmer than it is today, thereby facilitating entirely new pandemics. Much like the Breaking Bad cold open we talked about earlier, it achieves multiple things at once. Firstly, it immediately grounds the narrative by giving us a hypothesis about how the apocalypse we'd be seeing started. This isn't some miraculous event that happened out of the blue. While it is still a stretch in terms of what could happen in the real world, the fungus itself is based on a very real fungi that infects ants. But secondly, it establishes this bleak outlook of helplessness. People knew about this possibility decades ago, but against the power of nature, they were helpless. No amount of preparation or resistance was ever enough. So even faster than the original game, the story is grounded, it's bleak, and almost fatalistic in its tone. So in that sense, I think it's got that down to a T. But in the case of The Last of Us, I think it's rule numero 2 that is far more interesting, that being the translation process. When you're taking a book to screen or manga to screen, you are dealing with a story-to-story transfer, if you will. You just take the story in medium A and transfer it onto medium B. But with a game, how do you handle gameplay sections? Especially in such a narrative-forward game such as The Last of Us. That's exactly where the importance of a vision and creative direction comes in. In the game, there are a few very brutal moments of violence that drive home the cruelty of the world, but because it is still a game, naturally you must also have gameplay sections in between these moments. And what do you think is the gameplay in a survival game? Of course, you mow down countless infected and, more importantly, countless dudes to the point that Joel has basically single-handedly wiped out a small town by the end of the game. The show, however, chooses to 1. More explicitly acknowledge the fact that Joel is an old dude, he shouldn't be running around like a Terminator, and 2. Makes those cruel moments of violence far more rare and thereby feel much more important. When Joel finally kills someone in the show, sure, he is already desensitized to it to a certain extent, but it is still a human life, and it weighs on him so much more than you could ever convey in a video game. The game is ultimately a brutal human-centric story, but that is somewhat diluted by the gameplay sections, which again throw like 50 people at you at a time. Let's be honest, when we're playing a video game, it's just kind of a given that, yeah, we'll be shooting a bunch of dudes. The TV version, on the other hand, can really concentrate the importance of violence in the story, and when it finally hits, oh boy, does it hit hard. It doesn't try to copy the game's version, it translates it, because those gameplay sections would just seem goofy. A 50-something-year-old dude shouldn't be mowing down 30 guys at a time in a grounded survival series. In live action, that would really stick out. But at the same time, it has immense respect for the original material, much of which I think has to be attributed to Craig Mazin, the executive producer of the show. Perhaps this is me drawing conclusions where there really aren't any, but I think with him also being the executive producer of Chernobyl, which by design is meant to be a at least mostly accurate historical story, his attention to detail when it comes to an adaptation probably shouldn't be that surprising. If you've listened to him talk on The Last of Us Companion podcast, for example, you will have heard the process of constantly going back and forth with Neil Druckmann, the writer of the game, to discuss each and every change they made to the show. And I think it's exactly that humility and appreciation for the original work that has now resulted in Neil even saying, "I wish I had that in the game, you have improved on parts of my work." So again, smart choices on what to change. But again, as with all things, it is of course not all sunshine and rainbows. A criticism that was thrown around a lot is that there is a severe lack of infected in the show, something I do tend to agree with. But it is also something I understand wasn't totally necessary with the vision they set out with. There are sequences with plenty of infected, not as many as the game, but they do convey what they're meant to convey. The human story that is at the heart of The Last of Us. There could have been infected just like there are in the gameplay sections, but for the human story, it was not entirely necessary. So when it comes to The Last of Us, I think it's safe to say that it stands perfectly fine as a standalone story, and it stands perfectly fine as an adaptation. It feels like The Last of Us, and it is the story of The Last of Us told through a slightly different lens that better fits the medium. It has heart, and it has vision.
And now for something completely different.
Let's move from games to comic books. For those of you who have been around the channel already, you'll know that I've spent a good 2 years now chronicling exactly where I think The Walking Dead went wrong and eventually lost its vision and connection to the comic books. So here, I just want to briefly look at how the first seasons actually incorporated a lot of major changes from the source material, but were still successful because they had the heart and the vision of the comic. It's only way later that even when trying to replicate the book beat for beat, it just no longer felt like the story of the comic book. So again, let us apply the 2 rules. First, tone. Much like The Last of Us and Breaking Bad, the show starts with a cold open. One which, big surprise, is an entirely new addition for the show and never appears in the comic book. It's set on a desolate road, the traffic lights all turned off and cars turned upside down. This immediately tips you off that we are in some sort of crisis situation. But it's quiet, almost eerily quiet, as we see a lone sheriff walk up to a gas station that appears to have been turned into a campsite. As he walks further, there are decomposing bodies, boxes and boxes of personal belongings, and finally a no gas sign, immediately putting our protagonist in a similar sense of helplessness as we talked about with The Last of Us. We know that he is in trouble, and there does not seem to be much help available. The most important scene happens just as he turns to walk away. He hears movements, noticing what looks to be a little girl reaching down for a teddy bear. Naturally, being an officer himself, he immediately calls out to offer help. But as she turns around, we see that he is already too late. Her zombified moans now breathing, I guess, undead life into the scene as she quickly begins to close in on him. And as his breathing becomes uneasy, he pulls out the revolver and... just like that, the tone for the rest of the series is set. A lone police officer, his clothes still perfectly fresh, barely a stubble forming on his face, shoots a little girl straight in the face. The sheer bleakness of the world is captured brilliantly in those opening 5 minutes. You immediately know that you will be watching a very, very dark story. So in terms of tone, it's got that in droves. But it's rule numero 2 where things get very interesting. Unlike The Last of Us, which aimed to change things to better fit the medium, such as truncating the countless battles, changing a few characters to make them stand out more, and so on, The Walking Dead's adaptation came awfully close to changing the very fabric laid out by Kirkman with the comic book. You see, Robert Kirkman created The Walking Dead with the philosophy that it is an apocalypse that never ends. By design, there is no cure, no explanation of how the apocalypse started, nothing. Keep in mind that this was still just 2003, and the zombie genre was still very novel. Even basic things like reanimation after death were still huge mysteries. Ultimately, it was always a story about humanity and how it adapts to the apocalypse. The zombies were simply a backdrop for said story. The title of The Walking Dead, both in the words of Kirkman as well as clearly by the story, it refers to the people. Similarly, the comic books infected were only ever slow, dumb, stumbling bodies, and that's it. There were a few tiny deviations, like some infected simply sat while others constantly walked around. But all in all, they were always the same, because again, it was not a zombie story. It was a human story set in a zombie apocalypse. And that's where the show took a pretty significant departure right from the get-go. It added some level of intelligence to the zombies. It added an entirely new storyline about visiting the CDC, a place that naturally has information on the infection. And it even tried spinning the show into what would basically be a sort of an anthology series rather than the very focused narrative of the books. But the thing is, despite the massive departures that I myself was more so against rather than for, it is undeniable that it still fit the vision. The zombies were never special enough to detract from the human-centric story. The story of the CDC, by and large, only worked to further that sense of hopelessness, as our characters are explicitly told that there is no hope. And even the pseudo-anthology approach that was thrown around with Season 2 would have fit the human-centric vision set out by Kirkman. And again, while I personally am very glad that many of those initial ideas were scrapped as the show switched showrunners and converged back to a more authentic adaptation, I would still say Season 1 is a nearly perfect adaptation of the book, even if it is not totally authentic. We loop back to translate, do not copy. Things that work on paper will not work in live action. Your suspension of disbelief is far more pronounced when you're reading something on paper, and the creative vision must account for that discrepancy or the tone of the world will be gone. As I mentioned, and as I think everyone on the internet knows, The Walking Dead is a whole case study in and of itself, as it was later juggled around between different showrunners, and the creative vision took drastic shifts over the course of the show, with it ultimately becoming nearly unrecognizable when compared to the source material or even earlier seasons of the show itself. And I don't mean that in the good way of the show evolved, but rather the what happened sense. Big surprise, Kirkman himself was also no longer involved in the production in any way, so it was basically in freefall. The show simply had too many different creative visions, and the tone set out in the early days was just entirely gone. Showrunners started to take massive departures from the source material that both those familiar with the comic as well as TV-only viewers nearly universally agreed were horrible decisions for seemingly no other reason than, well, ego, and that they can shape the story however they want. If you watch the show, you definitely know exactly what I'm talking about, but the heart of the story was simply not there anymore. Moments ripped straight out of the comic just felt different because the stakes and the vision was just not there. For those of you who have stuck around until the end, you'll hear people say Season 9 was actually good. Which one is again when showrunners were changed, but two, it did not last because while the vision was solid, there were just too many cracks that had already begun to form. And while the story tried to recover as best it could, it was not The Walking Dead anymore, plain and simple. Some immediately jumped to saying that it was just too long, but no, there are many series that are way longer and people eat it up even to this day. The problem is that it simply lost its vision. So what can we learn from The Walking Dead? I think the most important takeaway is that you can make very fundamental changes so long as you stick to the vision. If you're curious, there is literally hours worth of me talking about The Walking Dead, but the show took many drastic departures from the book. But everyone, including me, ate it up because the vision was there, until it wasn't. There'll be people who will scream from the rooftops that things should be adapted identically, often myself included. But the one universal truth is that if the changes are just good, people will watch it and enjoy it. Again, many adaptations that fail are not just poor adaptations, they're also just bad. Well, the early days of The Walking Dead took pretty major departures, some hit and miss sure, but it never lost its way. For context, the literal peak of the series, the premiere that attracted over 17 million viewers in the US alone, never happened in the book. Translates, do not copy and do not lose vision. So, with a couple of good examples out of the way, let us tackle one that is just universally bad. Unlike the movie that does not exist in Ba Sing Se, this one didn't even really try to replicate the original, which would be sort of fine if it didn't just come off as a parody. I don't know about you, but it still boggles my mind that there are studios that have adapted The Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, and countless other, for lack of a better expression, fantasy-centric stories, yet we are still struggling in adapting Death Note, one of the most grounded stories in anime. Ditto for Monster. But anyway, let's pick up the pace and quickly apply the two rules to Death Note. Tone. It's not there. The anime follows a prodigy bored out of his mind. By design, he lives a modest but a basically perfect life. His family is happy, there are no major hardships, he is an exemplary student poised to become one of Japan's brightest, and so on. That is exactly what makes him acquiring the notebook and developing his god complex so thrilling. It's that immense juxtaposition between the perfect student Light and the ice-cold murderer Kira that makes the entire cat and mouse game between him and Elle worth following. Even in the most dire of situations, his approach is, albeit sometimes a little over-designed, still meticulous and calculated. The movie, on the other hand, number one, adds a whole bunch of additional family drama to Light, which we'll get to in a second, but two, tells you that he is smart while he is literally dumb as a brick. Big spoilers for the movie, but let's be honest, literally no one cares. If the anime Light is literally ready to set everything ablaze to hide the notebook, while openly manipulating the people closest to him to attain his goals, the movie Light shows off the notebook to the first girl he meets because he's thirsty, I guess. It completely misses the point of why Light could do what he did in the first place. It's that mixture of intelligence, charm, and lack of emotional attachment to anything that made him capable of all of those horrific acts. The movie version just does not have any of those things. He's not smart, he's awkward, not charming, and he is a hopeless teenager. Obviously, the anime also has the angle of Light being incredibly smart, but not too wise. But it is still that unprecedented intelligence that allows him to get ahead. The movie version is not wise and not smart. And then the family drama angle. Again, the whole point of the story is that Light pursues his goal largely out of boredom and a god complex. That is it. There is absolutely no need to add additional family troubles to try to explore some sort of family ethics or whatever, especially considering it is barely a 2-hour movie and it never touches on any of it in any meaningful way. I used a silly Breaking Bad example earlier already, but to give you an even more explicit one, imagine this. Walter is not a chemistry teacher. He doesn't have cancer, he only has a few problems here and there with his marriage, and that is it. He then sees the drug bust on TV and becomes a kingpin because he's apparently a genius now and wants a ton of money. And when he gets caught, he comes clean, just giving up all of his money. Cut to black. Truly a masterclass in storytelling. With Death Note, I have been sort of tying the translation and the tone rules together because both of them are so intertwined. But that's sort of the thing. I think there is a universe where you can tell a story of a more brash and frankly not very smart user of the notebook, and it is an interesting story. But then just don't try to disguise it as being Death Note's. The saying show don't tell shouldn't be interpreted as tell me Light is smart but show me he is dumb, you know? Out of fear of rambling on, I think the ending is kind of the perfect summary of everything wrong with this version.
It's rewind time.
He uses the notebook to save himself and kill Mia, and upon waking up in the hospital, tries explaining his actions to his father. On the other side of the story, L finds a piece of paper from the notebook and considers killing Light, which, by the way, is like the complete antithesis of his character, but whatever. That is where the film ends, and when in interviews they talked about the ending, the answer they gave is basically, yeah, we had multiple endings, but decided to just leave it up to interpretation. Now, don't get me wrong, I am an avant-garde enjoyer, but just not finishing something isn't leaving it up to interpretation. Not filling out a math exam isn't leaving it up to interpretation, it's just not finished. What was the message of this story? It wasn't a poetic conclusion to Light's story in how his crimes eventually caught up to him, exactly like Ryuk warned. There was no debate of what justice truly is. They basically wrote L into a corner and then just threw up their arms because neither ending makes sense. If he kills Light, well, that is the antithesis of his character. It would validate Kira's perspective, killing criminals. If he doesn't kill Light, well then, Light is a serial killer that gets off scot-free. On a fundamental level, the movie is not Death Note's, neither in tone nor in story. It has absolutely no creative vision, and the tiny speckles of story it does have all lead to a meaningless dead end. Paradoxically, the best part of the movie is William Dafoe's performance as Ryuk and his CG model, but in the larger context of the movie, even that seems somewhat uncanny as the only real remnants of how Light and Ryuk would interact in the original, while everything surrounding it is just a cheap imitation. So again, if they were to take the idea of the Death Note itself and write an entirely new story about, I don't know, Barry Chopsticks and about how he uses the notebook incorrectly, I think there is potential. But it's that uncanny imitation that just screams a lack of vision and tonal inconsistency, with Light's and L's characters being the most glaring examples of that. But okay, we've talked about the good, we've talked about the bad. Now let us talk about the ugly. Cowboy Bebop. And oh boy, is this a fascinating case. I'll be fully honest with you, when I first saw the trailer, I was duped. I was a good 90% certain that this is it. It looked like Cowboy Bebop, it mostly felt like Cowboy Bebop, and it certainly had the style of Cowboy Bebop, with the trailer still being a S-tier example of how to sell a series. And the thing is, I do think it had a very solid vision, and the changes they made to the story were to fit that vision. I might catch a ton of flack for this, but I think if you were to sit down and watch live-action Cowboy Bebop without knowing anything about the anime, it's an okay sci-fi story. Visually, it's cool, I think the casting is also generally decent, and the story it tells is fine. It doesn't run into the problems of trying to tell a different story but coming off as a parody running into a brick wall like Death Note, and it also isn't just a uncanny replica of the original like Avatar. But it does lack the heart of what made Cowboy Bebop Cowboy Bebop. It's an okay show, but a poor adaptation. Again, I am not here to do a complete dissection, there is hours worth of that on YouTube already, but I don't think that's even entirely necessary to get the point across. The anime is largely a collection of smaller stories with a deeper, more subtle underlying narrative, all of which depict the somewhat depressing reality of humanity. It's a futuristic setting where people can traverse space much like we do here on Earth, and that's exactly what it's about. Through the one-off adventures, we slowly come to the realization that even in the future, nothing has really changed. Crime still exists, good and bad people still clash in their morals and beliefs, and so on. And it's amongst those very human-centric stories that we begin to slowly piece together the underlying story of Spike, Vicious, and Julia. A story that is a very good showcase of show don't tell. You are never spoon-fed the questions or the answers. Rather, as we explore the world of Cowboy Bebop, we get to know the characters and we slowly begin to piece together their pasts. The live-action version, on the other hand, just dilutes all of that world building to just be a story of Spike, Julia, and Vicious. Unlike The Last of Us, which truncated the combat sequences that just wouldn't work in a live-action setting, it truncated the heart of the story itself. It's like if you removed all the people Joel and Ellie meet along the way and made the story just about the two of them. Where the anime uses the world itself to tell you their story, the live-action version just removes absolutely all of that ambiguity and basically spells it out. So in a very, very macro sense, it is the same story, it just doesn't have the heart of the anime. To give you another quick example, Jets. The anime's message, much like the rest of the story, is about how cops and the justice system as a whole can be bots. The underlying theme is one of corruption. It's a commentary on the state of the world and how, again, no amount of technology can cure human greed. The live-action version, on the other hand, boils it down to not the department as a whole, but just Jet's old partner. Instead of telling a more subtle and more morally gray story, it just gives you a hero story. Which, while yes, makes sense from his character's perspective and is an okay story, it just doesn't align with the message of Cowboy Bebop. The tone the world sets out is just not the same. Again, it is not totally off like Death Note, but it's just not the same vision that the original has. So, what can we learn from all of these things? We have The Last of Us, which is about 90% faithful in both tone and the raw story and was successful. We have The Walking Dead, and we're talking about early days here, but it was very faithful in tone, but made significant changes to the story itself, but was still very, very successful. We have live-action Avatar. It had a vision that absolutely did not match the original, but it tried replicating the story regardless, resulting in a uncanny mess. We have live-action Death Note, which had neither a vision nor a story, resulting in a bit of a dumpster fire. And finally, we have Cowboy Bebop, which had both a creative vision and its own way of telling that story, resulting in a mostly decent show, but a poor adaptation. Which again, leads me to the core conclusion that the success of an adaptation is decided by the tone or creative vision, call it whatever, and the ability to translate the material while still retaining the identity of the story. People always get worked up over set designs, casting, music, and a dozen other things, but to give you a quick example, when Andrew Lincoln was cast as Rick Grimes, everyone laughed saying that he is a British dude who does rom-coms, not a hardened survivor. But surprise surprise, with a good story, in a few short years he became the literal face of the franchise. When Bryan Cranston was cast as Walter White, we got one of the greatest r/age like milk images of all time. And the same goes for just about any actor out there. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these things don't matter. Obviously they do. I mean, look at Henry Cavill for example. But so long as everyone involved understands the story they are telling, the tone and the underlying story will always reign supreme. Everything else surrounding that is just sprinkles on top. And so naturally, this begs the question of which adaptations currently in the works will be successful. Well, the first one that may or may not be fully released by the time you're watching this is One Piece. If it's already out, feel free to judge me on how it turned out. But if you ask me, it absolutely has captured the tone of the original, and the more I see the cast interact both on-screen and off-screen, the more I feel confident that the heart of the story will be captured very, very well. As for the translation process, we can already observe both visual as well as more story-centric changes. But all of them, so far at least, seem to be with the explicit goal of making it fit the medium. Roger's famous speech, for example, has gone from a little goofy to a far more hardened and serious pirate king. A more subtle change we can observe right away are the outfits, a problem that can be very easily overlooked with adapting anime. When you're watching an animated show, your suspension of disbelief is far stronger. The character can be thrown around, stabbed, drenched in water, have their clothes slashed, etc, etc. But when they finally get back up, their clothes will still be exactly the same, just a bit scruffed up, and you won't bat an eye. In live action though, that does not fly. That is one of the first things people pointed out when they saw the trailer. Some of the outfits just look a little bit too clean, if you will. But the thing is, we have already seen that producers have meticulously recreated many of Oda's own designs to give the crew many different outfits that should make it feel a lot more natural. They won't be action figures running around in their signature outfits. They do change clothes multiple times. Ditto for the countless Easter eggs hidden all throughout the trailer. It all comes back to respecting the source material. From every single thing I've seen so far, and I've been following it for a good while now, it has been overlooked by Oda himself, and it is a lovingly translated form of the original story with changes being made only to improve it, rather than out of some weird ego problem of making it different. The only thing I'll be interested in is seeing how well it works as a standalone piece of media, as my opinion there is obviously very, very biased. But even with that, I give it a solid 70% chance of being very successful. I would give it higher if it wasn't for Cowboy Bebop very much tricking me. The next obvious one is Avatar The Last Airbender. No, not the movie, that does not exist, but the show. With this one, we have far less to work with. And many of you will have also heard about the original creators departing the production over quote-unquote creative differences. And while I myself do have some tinfoil conspiracy theories about the timing of their departure and the announcement of their own Avatar studio, and how certain non-disclosure agreements work, let's not try to read the tea leaves as to what the situation actually looked like and just look at what we know for sure. Well, we know that the first season has the same runtime as the original, and we know that it will expand on some things that the original never had time for. But at the end of the day, it aims to retell the same story. Unlike One Piece, I do generally think that the story of Avatar is a lot more grounded, so that doesn't really surprise me. It's rather the tone and the interactions of Team Avatar that are the biggest points of concern for me. That said though, we have seen them interact, and they themselves are being pushed as a point of marketing instead of just some faceless trailers or teasers. And that does make me feel confident that the wacky, goofy atmosphere we see between them would also translate to screen. But again, I'm not coping here, we have relatively little to work with, so while I do think that both the tone as well as the translation process seems to be going in the right direction, I would give it a very nondescript 50% chance of success. We just really need to see more really, but considering my confidence in these things usually starts at a negative 42%, think of 50% to still be a good sign. And finally, the one we know literally nothing about, the Duffer Brothers' take on Death Note. We don't even know whether it's supposed to be an authentic retelling of the original or another pseudo remix or how long it's supposed to be or anything. But I would like to think that with the Duffer Brothers taking the helm, they would look at the absolute catastrophe that was the first movie and learn where it all went wrong. At least in terms of tone, I think if it goes like the first season of Stranger Things, we'd be in a very good place. Maybe it's just a me thing, but I always found the later seasons a little lighter in terms of tone. Whereas with Death Note, I think we really need to maintain that air of coldness all throughout, and even more so with the Yotsuba part of the story. That in mind, literally just because Netflix has already failed miserably once, and because it is taken up by the Duffer Brothers, I give it a solid 10% chance of being successful. Yes, I know that's very generous. But the last thing I want to talk about is the turning point that I think One Piece and Avatar will be, as I genuinely think this is a bit of a breaking point when it comes to adapting anime. Just like we've seen historically with certain games in a certain genre flopping and then the entire genre sort of dying down, I think this will be it. I think if these fail, that'll be it for anime adaptations for at least a little while. In a very bizarre twist, video games seem to be doing more than fine, with Mario of all things getting a good adaptation, and now we have Last of Us, which no doubt has sparked interest in adapting other more narrative-focused games, like God of War being in production already. But point is, I think video game adaptations of all sorts, both live action and non-live action, is something we'll be seeing a lot more of in the foreseeable future. The Last of Us adaptation basically showed that a faithful adaptation will be successful and video game stories are good for a reason. But when it comes to manga and anime, I genuinely think that if One Piece of all things, one of the goofiest series out there turns out to be good, we might see a huge shakeup when it comes to any anime adaptations on the horizon. I know, for those of us on the interwebs, it might be a hard pill to swallow, but there are really a ton of people who don't watch anime for the simple reason of it being animated and the stigma around anime stories. So if a truly faithful adaptation turns out to be a success, for Netflix or any other studio, that becomes a money-printing machine. But more importantly, our favorite stories will see a new audience. Much like reboots, opinion here is obviously mixed, but purely from a financial perspective, if all they need to do is cherry-pick certain series that could be translated into live action without the need of a huge budget and massive rewrites, they will do so. The live-action Death Note movie was largely written from scratch. Well, if they just followed the original story and made slight changes, 1, it is already a much safer bet because they know the story itself is very popular and people love it, and 2, simply because the majority of it is already there, you don't need to make something from nothing. So like I said at the top of the video, I still hold the opinion of give it a shot. If it's good, great, we all win. If it's bad, who cares? We have lost nothing. The original is there, we can still talk about it, we can still love it. So to summarize everything we've talked about today, I think it's important to just remember 2 important things. Understand the tone of the story you are telling. You must have a clear vision that aligns with the original story. And number 2, if you must make changes to fit the medium, do so, but never lose sight of that original vision. And that's the video. Guess this is my annual super meta video for the channel, so hope you enjoyed it. I know live actions tend to draw out some pretty spicy opinions, so keep it civil, but do let me know what you think of all these developments. I am genuinely curious. And if you want to follow my ramblings on all these, give the second channel a look. I've been covering a lot of those there. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Willow Tree. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!